Ooh, oh boy. So hi there, this is the recording for the PyCon 2020 workshop on sound poetry and machine learning models. My name's Allison Parrish. I'm a poet and computer programmer and an assistant arts professor at New York University. Just as sort of an introduction to the code material that we're going to go over later, I have a slide deck prepared that has some of the underlying artistic and aesthetic issues that are at play in these models. And it also has a little bit about the technical details of the implementation of the models, just as some background knowledge as we move ahead with the material. This is a machine learning model that I made called Pincelate that knows how to spell and sound out words. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, show some of the mischief that I've gotten up to with the model, mischief that you too can get up to. But the first half of this is going to be about why I, as a poet, would need such a thing as a machine learning model of spelling and how to sound words out. The second half gets a bit more into the technical nitty-gritty of how the model works. So starting off with font aesthetics, sound symbolism, and sound poetry. So, first off, we should talk about the genre of nonsense verse, of which the best known examples in English, one of the best known examples is Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, and I have the first stanza of that poem here. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borogoves and the mome raths outgrabe." What's interesting to me about this poem is that the words like brillig and gimble and outgrabe, those were all invented for this poem. But even though they're made up words and they're not in the dictionary, they still seem to suggest meaning by virtue not just of the context they occur in, like the syntactic context that they occur in this poem, but also in the way that they sound. In other words, Alice says this in Through the Looking Glass about Jabberwocky. Even though it doesn't make sense, it, quote, somehow seems to fill my head with ideas. This concept of sounds, the sound of words filling our heads with ideas, shows up in a bunch of interesting places, especially in psychology and anthropology. Studies in synesthesia have shown that people from all around the world that are native languages of many different languages, or native speakers of many different languages, across different age groups, across, cutting across all kinds of demographics, they all have something in common, which is that if you point them to these two shapes and you ask them to label which one they think is Kiki and which one they think is Booba, they'll almost always point to the sharp pointy shape as being Kiki and the round bulbous shape as being Booba. This is what's called phonesthetics. Phonesthetics meaning the study of what words feel like, the emotional response that you get from words, the synesthetic sense that you get from words. A literary genre that offers just easy examples of sound symbolism is fantasy and science fiction. An example that I like to bring up with this is Sofia Samatar, who's one of my favorite fantasy authors. In an interview, she describes a process about inventing languages for her fantasy novels, Stranger in Alondria and The Winged Histories, which are my two favorite fantasy novels, by the way. She says the creation of the Alondrian language was closely tied to the development of names. To invent the names, I chose small chunks of sound that seemed pretty to me and played with combining them. It's that seemed pretty to me thing that is interesting to me. And I imagine the process works in similar ways for other fantasy authors. Here, again, stretches of language are being composed not for their conventional meaning, but for the aesthetics of their acoustic and articulatory material, making up words based on whether they sound pretty. If you take that idea of inventing words for their phonetic properties to the logical extreme, you get a genre of poetry called sound poetry, and that's a form of poetry that emphasizes the sound of speech and dismisses the importance of conventional syntax and semantics as principles to organize text. As